esteem. Let's start here, because if you don't understand this first piece, everything else becomes confusing. When we talk about narcissism, we are not talking about confidence, esteem. We are not talking about ambition. We are not even talking about someone who posts too many selfies or loves being the center of attention. We are talking about a pattern, a deeply ingrained, esteem, rigid, repetitive pattern of thinking, behaving, and relating that shows up across situations and over time. And that distinction matters, esteem. Because if you mistake narcissism for a personality quirk, you will keep excusing it. You will keep minimizing it. You will keep telling yourself, well, or they just had a bad day, or they're stressed. But narcissism isn't about a bad day, esteem. It's about a chronic way of moving through the world that revolves around entitlement, grandiosity, validation seeking, and most critically, a lack of empathy, esteem. Now here's where people get tripped up. Narcissism can look very different on the surface. Sometimes it's loud and obvious. Sometimes it's charismatic, charming, magnetic, esteem. Other times it's covert, vulnerable, even self-pitying. But underneath all of those presentations is the same core structure, esteem. An unstable sense of self that must be constantly propped up by external validation. Think about that for a moment. A stable sense of self doesn't need constant applause, esteem. It doesn't crumble under criticism. It doesn't need to dominate every conversation. It doesn't need to win at all costs. But narcissism is built on a fragile foundation, esteem. And because that foundation is fragile, the person must continuously regulate it from the outside. Through admiration, through control, through attention, through power, esteem. That's why the pattern repeats. It's not random, it's not accidental, it's not situational. You may notice that in the beginning, everything feels intense, magnetic, almost cinematic, esteem. But over time, there are recurring themes. They struggle with accountability. They react defensively to even gentle feedback. They shift blame. They rewrite history, esteem. They center themselves in every narrative. They expect special treatment. And when their needs aren't prioritized, the reaction can be disproportionate. That repetition is the clue, esteem. Healthy people can behave selfishly sometimes. Healthy people can get defensive. Healthy people can mess up. The difference is flexibility. The difference is repair. The difference is empathy, esteem. A healthy person, when confronted with the impact of their behavior, might feel uncomfortable, but they can reflect, they can apologize, they can adjust. In narcissism, esteem, that flexibility is limited. The system is too rigid. Accountability feels like annihilation. So instead of reflection, you get deflection. Instead of repair, you get reversal, esteem. Instead of empathy, you get minimization. And over time, being in a relationship with this pattern is disorienting. Because you keep thinking you're dealing with isolated incidents. You think, esteem, okay, that argument was rough, but we'll move past it. Or, they didn't mean that. Or, if I just explain it better, they'll understand. But the conversation never really lands, esteem. The shift never really happens. The same conflicts resurface in slightly different forms. That's when it becomes important to zoom out. Patterns reveal truth in a way single events never can, esteem. Another essential piece to understand is that narcissism is not just about how someone sees themselves. It's about how they use other people. Relationships in this pattern, esteem, are often transactional. People become sources of validation, admiration, access, status, or control. And when someone is no longer serving that function, the dynamic shifts, esteem. That's painful to hear, but it's necessary to understand. Because when you're in it, you may believe that if you love harder, explain better, sacrifice more, stay calmer, esteem, they'll finally get it. But the issue isn't your effort. The issue is that the relationship may not be built on mutuality to begin with. It may be built on utility, esteem. And when you start recognizing that, it changes how you interpret everything. You begin to see that the charm wasn't depth. The intensity wasn't intimacy. The promises weren't partnership, esteem. They were part of a cycle designed, consciously or unconsciously, to secure supply. Now I want to be very clear about something, esteem. Understanding narcissism as a pattern is not about demonizing people. It's about clarity. It's about realism. It's about protecting your psychological well-being, esteem. You can have compassion for someone's wounds without volunteering to be wounded by them. And here's another nuance: narcissism exists on a spectrum, esteem. Not everyone with narcissistic traits meets criteria for a personality disorder. But when those traits are rigid, pervasive, and harmful, when they consistently erode your sense of self-esteem, that's when you need to pay attention. Because the impact on you is what matters. Living inside this pattern often means you slowly begin adjusting yourself. You anticipate their moods, esteem. You manage their reactions. You soften your words. You shrink your needs. You become hyper-aware. Over time, esteem. You might not even recognize how much of yourself you've edited just to keep the peace. And this is where the erosion begins. Not dramatically, not overnight, but gradually. Esteem. You may find yourself second guessing your perceptions, doubting your memory. Esteem. Questioning whether you're too sensitive. You might start carrying responsibility for conflicts that weren't yours to hold. And because the pattern includes intermittent reinforcement, esteem, moments of warmth, charm, or affection, you hold on to hope that the good version will return. But remember, patterns are more honest than promises. Esteem. When behavior repeats consistently over time, especially across different contexts and relationships, that's data. And we have to learn to trust data over potential, over fantasy, esteem over what we wish were true. Another critical piece to understand is that narcissism often involves a profound difficulty with genuine empathy. Not performative empathy, not strategic empathy, esteem, but sustained, other-centered empathy. When something affects you, the conversation may quickly pivot back to them. Your pain may be minimized, compared, or overshadowed, esteem. And if you express hurt, you may find yourself defending why you're hurt instead of being comforted for being hurt. That's not a small thing. That reshapes your nervous system. Over time, esteem. You may become more anxious, more vigilant, more depleted, because you're in a dynamic where your emotional reality isn't consistently validated. And humans require validation, not flattery, esteem, not exaggeration, but acknowledgement. Without acknowledgement, self-trust erodes. So when I say narcissism is a pattern, esteem, I'm asking you to stop looking at single moments and start looking at trajectories. What has this relationship felt like over months, over years? Are conflicts resolved or recycled? Esteem. Do you feel expanded or diminished? Do you feel safe expressing needs or cautious? Your body often knows before your mind does. Patterns also show up in how they handle boundaries. Esteem. When you assert one, is it respected? Or is it challenged, mocked, ignored, or punished? Healthy dynamics allow for difference. Esteem. Narcissistic patterns often interpret boundaries as rejection or defiance. And so the cycle continues. Esteem. The reason this is the foundation of everything else we're going to discuss is because if you don't identify the pattern, you'll keep trying to fix episodes. You'll keep negotiating moments. Esteem. You'll keep searching for the right words to unlock change. But you cannot negotiate someone out of a personality structure. You can only decide how close you want to stand to it. Esteem. Clarity is power. Naming a pattern is power. Because once you see it, you stop internalizing it, you stop asking, what's wrong with me? And start asking, what is this dynamic doing to me? Esteem. And that shift is profound. It moves you from self-blame to self-awareness, from confusion to recognition, from chaos to clarity. Narcissism is not about confidence. It is not about ambition, esteem. It is not about someone having high standards. It is a rigid, repetitive pattern rooted in fragility, fueled by validation, and maintained through control and lack of empathy, esteem. And when you understand that, when you truly understand that, you stop excusing the behavior as a phase, you start seeing it for what it is. And that is the first step toward freedom, esteem. If you remember nothing else from today, remember this: isolated incidents can be explained away, but patterns tell the truth. Now that we understand narcissism as a pattern, not a bad mood, esteem, not a rough childhood moment, not just confidence gone wild, we have to talk about how this pattern pulls you in. Because here's the part that confuses almost everyone. Esteem. If narcissistic relationships were terrible from day one, no one would stay. They don't start with cruelty, they start with intensity. And intensity can feel like intimacy, esteem. This is the phase people often describe as magical. Electric, soulmate-level connection. You meet someone and within days, sometimes hours, it feels like you've known them forever, esteem. They mirror your interests. They share similar stories. They tell you you're unlike anyone they've ever met. The chemistry feels off the charts. The communication is constant. Esteem. Good morning texts, good night calls, long conversations about the future, big dreams, big plans. It feels validating in a way that's almost intoxicating. And here's why it works, esteem. It taps directly into fundamental human needs. We all want to feel seen. We all want to feel chosen. We all want to feel special. Love, bombing, and yes, that's what we're talking about. Esteem delivers all of that in concentrated form. But it's not the depth that hooks you. It's the speed. Healthy intimacy builds gradually. It unfolds. It develops as trust is earned over time, esteem. But in this dynamic, the closeness accelerates at a pace that feels thrilling. You may find yourself sharing deeply personal stories very early. You may feel unusually safe very quickly, esteem. You may think, I've never connected like this before. That rush is powerful. And it creates something critical: attachment. When someone showers you with admiration, attention, praise, esteem, and promises, your brain respikes, oxytocin flows. You feel bonded, you feel secure, you feel valued. And because it feels so good, esteem, you begin associating that person with emotional safety and excitement. But here's the key: intensity is not proof of stability. Love bombing often involves grand gestures, big declarations, as future faking. I've never felt this way. You're my forever. I want to travel the world with you. I can see us building a life together. These statements come early, esteem, sometimes before the foundation of the relationship even exists. And because it feels good, you don't question it. Why would you? Esteem. It feels like being chosen in a way you may never have experienced before. Now let's connect this back to the pattern we discussed earlier. If narcissism is fueled by validation and control, esteem, then securing your attachment quickly serves a purpose. The faster you bond, the more invested you become. The more invested you become, esteem, the harder it is to step back later when things begin to shift. And they do shift, because love bombing is not sustainable. It's not grounded in steady mutuality, esteem. It's often about securing supply, admiration, attention, reassurance. Once that attachment feels locked in, the dynamic begins to recalibrate. And this is where confusion sets in, esteem. The texts become less frequent. The praise becomes less effusive. The future talk slows down. You might feel a subtle pulling away, esteem. Or you might experience criticism that feels jarring compared to the earlier adoration. The same person who once idealized you may now begin pointing out flaws. Small at first, almost playful, esteem, but noticeable. You may think, what changed? That question can consume you. And because you experienced such a high in the beginning, you assume the answer must be you, esteem. Maybe you did something wrong. Maybe you became too comfortable. Maybe you said the wrong thing. So you try harder. You adjust. You give more. You communicate more clearly, esteem. You attempt to get back to that original magic. But here's the hard truth. The initial phase wasn't a baseline. It was a hook. It was an amplified version designed, esteem, consciously or unconsciously, to secure attachment. And intermittent reinforcement is one of the most powerful behavioral conditioning tools we know. Esteem. When warmth and withdrawal alternate unpredictably, attachment strengthens. You become hyper-focused on regaining the good moments. The uncertainty actually deepens the bond. Think about that, esteem. When the affection becomes inconsistent, you don't detach. You lean in. You try to solve it. You chase the version of them that once made you feel extraordinary. That's not weakness, esteem. That's neurobiology. But it's also the trap. Love bombing works because it creates contrast. When the devaluation phase begins, subtle criticism, emotional distance, unpredictability, esteem. You compare it to the golden beginning. And you tell yourself, they used to be so loving. So you hold on, you wait for that person to return. But here's something important to understand, esteem. The early version may not have been the most authentic version. It may have been the most strategic version. In healthy relationships, affection grows alongside knowledge, esteem. You learn each other's strengths and flaws gradually. In love-bombing dynamics, admiration is front-loaded before real knowledge exists. That should be a red flag, but when you're inside it, esteem, it feels flattering. And let's be honest, most of us are not taught to be cautious of excessive affection. We're taught to crave it. Movies glorify it. Social media celebrates it. Esteem. Fast love is romanticized. So when it happens, we don't pause. We assume we got lucky until the ground shifts. Now you're confused. You're anxious. You're analyzing text messages. Esteem. You're wondering if you imagined the connection. You may even question whether you're asking for too much. But step back and look at the pattern. Was the intimacy built slowly, esteem? Or did it escalate rapidly? Were promises made before consistency was demonstrated? Did the person seem deeply invested before truly knowing you? These are not small details, esteem. And here's something else that's critical. Love bombing is often followed by isolation, subtle at first. They want more of your time. They may frame it as passion. Esteem. I just want you all to myself. They may question your friends or imply that others don't understand your connection. The world narrows. The relationship becomes central, esteem. And when the devaluation phase intensifies, you're more alone. That isolation makes it even harder to reality check what's happening, esteem. Another layer of this dynamic is how it affects your sense of worth. During the love bombing phase, you feel elevated, chosen, extraordinary. When the shift happens, esteem, the withdrawal feels like a loss of value. So you internalize it. What did I do to fall off the pedestal? But here's the truth, the pedestal was never stable. It was built on projection, esteem, not reality. You were idealized, not truly seen. And when real life emerged, normal flaws, boundaries, differences, the illusion cracked. In narcissistic dynamics, esteem, others are often categorized as all good or all bad. Idealization and devaluation, there's very little room for nuanced humanity. So when the idealization ends, esteem, it can feel like emotional whiplash. And you're left trying to reconcile two versions of the same person. This is why understanding love bombing is so essential, esteem. It explains why leaving feels so hard. You're not just leaving someone who hurt you. You're grieving the fantasy of who you thought they were, esteem. You're grieving the future that was painted so vividly in those early conversations. And grief binds, but clarity frees. When you understand that the intensity was part of the pattern, esteem, not proof of destiny, something shifts. You stop romanticizing the beginning. You stop measuring the present against an illusion. You start evaluating the relationship based on consistency, esteem, respect, empathy, and accountability, not adrenaline, not grand gestures, not promises. And let's be clear, healthy love can be exciting. It can be passionate. It can be joyful. Esteem. The difference is sustainability. Healthy love doesn't need to overwhelm you to secure you. It doesn't rush intimacy to create dependency. It doesn't punish you later for being human. Esteem. So if you find yourself thinking, but it felt so real, understand this: feelings can be real even if the foundation wasn't solid. Esteem. The connection you experienced may have been genuine on your end. That doesn't mean the dynamic was healthy. You are not foolish for wanting to be loved deeply. Esteem. You are not naive for believing someone who spoke beautifully about the future. You are human. But going forward, intensity should never be mistaken for compatibility. Esteem. Speed should never be mistaken for security. And grand declarations should never replace consistent behavior. When someone shows up at full volume, immediately ask yourself, esteem, what happens when the volume drops? Because it will. And if the relationship cannot survive without constant amplification, it was never rooted in stability. Esteem. The beginning of a narcissistic dynamic often feels like the best part of a movie. Cinematic, sweeping, larger than life. But real relationships are not built on highlight reels. Esteem. They are built on steady presence. So the next time you feel that rush, that overwhelming, fast, all-consuming connection, pause, breathe, slow it down. Let actions catch up to words. Esteem. Let time reveal character. Because love that needs to sprint to secure you is often love that cannot sustain you. And here is the line I want you to remember. Esteem. If it starts like fireworks but cannot survive daylight, it was never love, it was a hook. Once you understand the pattern, esteem, and once you understand how the intensity at the beginning pulls you in, the next piece becomes easier to name, but it is often the most destabilizing part of the entire experience, esteem. And that is gaslighting. Gaslighting doesn't usually enter dramatically. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come with a warning label. It seeps in quietly, subtly. Esteem. It begins in moments that are easy to dismiss. You bring up something that hurt you and you hear, that's not what happened. You recall a conversation clearly and you're told, esteem. You're remembering it wrong. You express discomfort and you're met with, you're too sensitive. You point out inconsistency and the response is, you're overthinking it. At first, esteem. You may brush it off. Everyone misremembers sometimes. Everyone gets defensive sometimes. But remember what we talked about earlier. We are not looking at isolated incidents. Esteem. We are looking at patterns. When distortion becomes chronic, when your reality is repeatedly questioned, minimized, or rewritten, something begins to shift inside you. Esteem. Gaslighting is not just lying. It is the systematic undermining of another person's perception. It's not about winning an argument. It's about destabilizing your confidence in your own mind. Esteem. And when that happens consistently, the consequences are profound. You may begin to second-guess your memory. Esteem. You might replay conversations in your head trying to figure out if you misunderstood. You may even start documenting things, saving texts, taking screenshots, writing notes. Esteem. Just to reassure yourself that what you experienced was real. That's not a small thing. When you start gathering evidence to prove your own reality to yourself, esteem, something fundamental has been shaken. Here's how it often unfolds. In the early stages of the relationship, during that intense, idealized phase, your perceptions are validated. Esteem. You feel understood. You feel aligned. But as the dynamic shifts and control becomes more important than connection, your perceptions may start to threaten the narcissistic structure. Esteem. If you notice inconsistency, that's uncomfortable for someone who needs to maintain a flawless image. If you call out hurtful behavior, that challenges entitlement. Esteem. If you hold them accountable, that introduces shame. And shame in narcissistic patterns is intolerable. So instead of acknowledging the behavior, the focus turns to your reaction. Suddenly, esteem, the issue is not what happened. The issue is that you're dramatic or crazy or unstable or imagining things. Do you see how the shift works? Esteem. The spotlight moves from behavior to your perception. And over time, that shift erodes your trust in yourself. Gaslighting can also take the form of contradiction. Esteem. They may say something hurtful and later deny ever saying it. Or they may insist you agreed to something you never agreed to. They may promise change and when it doesn't happen, esteem, claim they never made that promise. It creates cognitive dissonance. Two conflicting realities existing at once, what you experienced and what you're being told. Human beings crave coherence. Esteem. We want the world to make sense. So when someone confidently insists that your memory is flawed, you may defer to their certainty, especially if they present as articulate, persuasive, esteem, or authoritative. Confidence can override truth in the moment. But here's what happens psychologically when your external reality is repeatedly invalidated: your internal compass weakens. Esteem. You become less assertive, less sure, less grounded. You might notice yourself prefacing statements with maybe I'm wrong, but, or I could be mistaken, but, or I don't know. Esteem. I just feel like that hesitancy is not accidental. It's the residue of repeated invalidation. Another layer of gaslighting involves minimizing emotional experiences. You say, esteem. That hurt me. And you hear, you're making a big deal out of nothing, or you always blow things out of proportion, or anyone else would be fine with that. Esteem. The message underneath is clear: your emotional response is defective. Over time, you may stop expressing hurt altogether. You swallow it, you rationalize it. Esteem. You convince yourself that you need to toughen up, that you need to be less reactive, that maybe you are the problem. And this is where the erosion becomes dangerous. Esteem. Because once you lose trust in your own perception, you become easier to control. If you don't trust your memory, you defer to theirs. If you don't trust your feelings, you silence them. Esteem. If you don't trust your judgment, you seek their approval. That dependency strengthens the dynamic. Gaslighting also isolates. If you try to reality check with friends or family, esteem, the narcissistic partner may preemptively undermine those relationships. Esteem. They don't understand us. They're jealous. They're trying to turn you against me. The goal is to position themselves as the only reliable narrator. Esteem. And once you're isolated from outside perspectives, the distortion deepens. Let's talk about the nervous system for a moment. Esteem. Living in a gaslighting dynamic keeps you in a state of hypervigilance. You're constantly scanning for inconsistencies. You're trying to prevent misunderstandings. You're analyzing tone, esteem, wording, timing. It's exhausting. Your body may feel anxious more often. You may have trouble sleeping. You may replay conversations long after they've ended. Esteem. That constant mental rehearsal is your brain trying to regain certainty. But certainty is hard to find in a distorted environment. Now here's something important. Esteem. Gaslighting doesn't always look malicious. Sometimes it's delivered calmly, even kindly. I think you're just stressed. You know your anxiety gets the best of you. I'm worried about you. Esteem. It can be wrapped in concern, and that makes it even more confusing, because now you're not just doubting your memory, you're doubting your mental stability. Over time, esteem. Some people in these dynamics begin seeking therapy, believing they are the unstable one. They present with anxiety, self-doubt, depression. And while therapy can be incredibly helpful, esteem, it's crucial to examine context. Symptoms don't arise in a vacuum. When you're chronically invalidated, anxiety is a reasonable response. Let's connect this back to the larger pattern. Esteem. Narcissism requires control of narrative. The image must remain intact. Accountability threatens that image, so rewriting reality becomes a defense. Esteem. If you can be convinced that the problem is your perception, then the system doesn't have to change. But here's the truth. Esteem. Healthy relationships allow for disagreement about facts without dismantling someone's sanity. Two people can remember events differently and still respect each other's perspective. Esteem. There's room for dialogue, there's curiosity, there's repair. Gaslighting eliminates curiosity, it replaces it with certainty, one person's certainty. And certainty, when used as a weapon, esteem, is powerful. One of the most painful moments for people leaving these dynamics is realizing how much they doubted themselves. They look back and think, I knew something was off. And yes, esteem, you probably did. Your body often knew that tight feeling in your chest, that confusion after conversations. Esteem. That sense of walking away from arguments more disoriented than when you entered them. Disorientation is a signal. Clarity tends to calm the nervous system. Esteem, even when the truth is uncomfortable. Distortion agitates it. So if you consistently felt scrambled, unsettled, unsure, that matters. Esteem. Rebuilding after gaslighting involves reclaiming your perception. It involves trusting your memory again, trusting your feelings again, esteem, validating your own experiences without waiting for external confirmation. That process can feel shaky at first, like learning to walk after instability, esteem. But every time you honor your perception, you strengthen that muscle. And let's be clear about something: making mistakes in memory does not mean you deserve to have your reality dismantled. Esteem. Esteem. Being emotional does not make you irrational. Having needs does not make you demanding. Gaslighting works because it exploits normal human fallibility and turns it into a weapon. Esteem. So as you move forward, whether you're still in the dynamic or stepping out of it, begin paying attention to how you feel after conversations. Do you feel understood or confused? Esteem. Do you feel heard or diminished? Do you feel steadier or shakier? Patterns tell the truth. If your sense of reality has been consistently undermined, that is not a communication problem. Esteem. That is a power problem. And reclaiming your reality is not dramatic. It is not rebellious. It is not selfish. It is survival. You deserve relationships where your perception is respected, esteem, where your emotions are acknowledged, and where disagreements do not require you to abandon your own mind. So here is what I want you to remember, esteem. If someone repeatedly makes you question your sanity instead of examining their behavior, the issue is not your perception, it is their need for control. Now, after understanding the pattern, esteem, the intensity of the beginning, and the erosion that comes from gaslighting, there's a question that almost always comes up at this point. Why me? Why did I end up in this dynamic, esteem? Why did they choose me? Was I naive? Was I weak? Was there something about me that invited this? And I want to slow this down right here, because this is where shame tends to creep in, esteem. Narcissistic dynamics do not typically target weakness, they target strength. They often gravitate toward people who are empathetic, conscientious, emotionally attuned, responsible, esteem, and self-reflective, people who think deeply, people who care deeply. People who are willing to look at themselves and ask, what could I do better? Now think about that, esteem. If someone lacks empathy, who benefits them more? Another person who lacks empathy or someone who has it in abundance? Empathy is beautiful. It allows you to connect, to understand nuance, esteem, to forgive, to support. But in the wrong dynamic, empathy becomes exploitable. Because if you are wired to understand other people's pain, esteem, you may overextend yourself trying to understand someone who repeatedly hurts you. You might say, they had a tough childhood, though they've been betrayed before. They're stressed at work, esteem. They don't mean it. You become the translator for their behavior. And because you are self-reflective, when conflict happens, you don't immediately assume the other person is wrong. Esteem, you pause. You ask yourself if you contributed, you look inward, that's maturity. But in a narcissistic dynamic, that self-reflection gets weaponized. If you're the kind of person who says, esteem, maybe I need to communicate better, you'll keep adjusting long after the other person has stopped adjusting entirely. If you're the kind of person who believes relationships require effort, esteem, you'll keep investing effort even when the return is shrinking. And here's something else that's important: conscientious people value commitment. They don't walk away easily. Esteem, they take promises seriously. So when love bombing paints a vivid future, you lock onto it. You hold it as something sacred, you work to protect it. Esteem. That loyalty can keep you in a situation far longer than someone less emotionally invested might stay. Now let's talk about emotional intelligence. If you're emotionally intelligent, esteem, you can read nuance, you can sense shifts in tone, you can anticipate needs. In healthy relationships, that creates deep intimacy. In narcissistic relationships, esteem, it can turn into hypervigilance. You start monitoring moods, you sense tension before words are spoken, you adjust in real time to prevent conflict. Esteem. You become the emotional regulator for the relationship, and because you're capable of doing that, you do it well. But you shouldn't have to. Esteem. Narcissistic individuals often struggle with regulating their own emotions, so they unconsciously outsource that regulation to the person closest to them. If you're empathetic, esteem, you step into that role, you soothe, you reassure, you stabilize. And slowly, without realizing it, you carry more and more emotional weight. Esteem. Another reason empathetic people get pulled in is because they believe in potential. They see who someone could be. They see glimpses of vulnerability beneath the grandiosity. They think, esteem, if I love them consistently enough, maybe that softer part will grow. But you cannot love someone into emotional maturity. Potential is not the same as pattern, esteem. And this is where the confusion intensifies, because you are not imagining the moments of vulnerability. They exist. You may have seen flashes of insecurity, fear, sadness, esteem. Those glimpses activate your compassion. You think this is the real them. But in narcissistic patterns, vulnerability often appears when control feels threatened. It can draw you back in, esteem. It can soften your boundaries. It can make you doubt your decision to step back. Empathetic people respond to vulnerability instinctively. That's a strength, esteem. But it must be paired with discernment. Let's also address something uncomfortable. Empathetic people sometimes struggle with boundaries. Not because they don't believe in them, esteem, but because they fear hurting others. If saying no might disappoint someone, you hesitate. If asserting a need might cause conflict, you soften it. In healthy relationships, esteem, that flexibility is appreciated. In narcissistic ones, it's exploited. If someone tests a boundary and it bends, they learn it can be pushed again and again and again. Over time, esteem, you may find yourself tolerating behavior you never thought you would tolerate. Not because your standards disappeared, but because your empathy kept finding explanations. Esteem. And here's the paradox: the very qualities that make you a loving partner, empathy, patience, willingness to grow, become the qualities that keep you stuck. Esteem. That realization can be devastating. It can make you want to harden, to shut down, become less giving. But I want to be very clear, the goal is not to lose your empathy, esteem. The goal is to protect it. Empathy without boundaries is self-abandonment. Empathy with boundaries is strength. Now let's explore another dynamic, esteem. Narcissistic individuals often seek admiration and validation. If you are someone who affirms others naturally, who celebrates their achievements, who uplifts the people you care about, esteem, that feels incredibly good to someone who craves admiration. You become a steady source of supply. At first, it feels reciprocal. They praise you, they elevate you, esteem. But as the relationship progresses, the balance shifts. Your role increasingly becomes supporter, cheerleader, stabilizer, and your own needs may receive less and less attention, esteem. If you are self-sufficient and capable, you may minimize your own needs. You might think, I can handle this, or it's not a big deal. So the imbalance grows quietly, esteem. Another layer is conflict style. Empathetic people tend to seek resolution. They want conversations, they want understanding. So when there's tension, you initiate dialogue, esteem. You try to clarify, you try to repair. In narcissistic dynamics, conflict may not be about resolution, it may be about dominance or deflection. So while you're seeking clarity, esteem, the other person may be shifting blame or escalating defensiveness. And because you value harmony, you may end up apologizing just to restore peace, even when the issue wasn't yours, esteem. Let's pause here. If you have ever walked away from an argument thinking, how did that become my fault? That's not accidental. That's the interaction between empathy and deflection, esteem. Empathetic people are more likely to take responsibility. Narcissistic patterns are more likely to avoid it. Do you see how that imbalance sustains itself? Esteem. There's also something important about hope. Empathetic people tend to believe people can grow. That's not foolish, it's optimistic, it's human. But growth requires accountability, esteem. It requires sustained effort. It requires self-awareness. You cannot carry someone else's growth for them. And when you try, you exhaust yourself. Now, esteem. I want to say something that might feel uncomfortable, but is deeply empowering. Being targeted in a narcissistic dynamic does not mean you are broken, esteem. It often means you are capable of deep connection. The work is not to become less connected. The work is to become more discerning, esteem. You can remain compassionate without tolerating mistreatment. You can understand someone's pain without absorbing their dysfunction. You can love deeply and still say, esteem, this is not healthy for me. That shift from self-blame to discernment is transformative, because when you stop asking, why was I chosen, and start asking, esteem, why did I stay, the answer often lies in your strengths, loyalty, hope, patience, belief in love. Those are not flaws. But they must be balanced with self-protection. As you heal, esteem, you may notice something interesting. Your empathy doesn't disappear, it becomes more precise. You start noticing red flags earlier. You start valuing consistency over chemistry, esteem. You start prioritizing reciprocity over intensity, and you begin choosing relationships where your empathy is met with empathy. That's the shift. Not shrinking who you are, esteem, but refusing to hand your best qualities to someone who uses them against you. So if you've been sitting here thinking, I should have known better, I want to gently challenge that narrative, esteem. You love the way you know how to love. The lesson is not to love less, it is to require more. Because empathy is a gift, but only when it flows both ways, esteem. And here's the truth I want you to carry with you. Your kindness was never the problem. Giving it to someone who couldn't honor it was. Once you understand the pattern, esteem. Once you recognize the intensity of the beginning, once you see how gaslighting erodes your reality, and how your empathy was never the weakness but the hook, esteem. There comes a pivotal moment in these dynamics. It's the moment when control starts to slip. And this is where everything becomes very revealing, esteem. As long as the narcissistic pattern feels secure, as long as admiration is flowing, as long as the narrative is intact, as long as you are adjusting and accommodating, esteem, things may remain relatively stable, not healthy, not balanced, but stable enough to maintain the illusion. But the second you begin to see clearly, the second you set a boundary, esteem, the second you detach emotionally, the second you stop reacting the way you used to, the system feels threatened. And when narcissistic control is threatened, behavior often escalates. Esteem, this is not random, it's predictable. If someone's sense of self depends on dominance, validation, and control, then losing that control feels destabilizing, even intolerable. Esteem. So the response can become sharper, louder, more chaotic. You may see rage that feels disproportionate, not irritation, rage, anger that seems to come out of nowhere, esteem, explosive reactions to small boundary-setting moments. You calmly say, I'm not okay with that, and suddenly you're facing a storm. That rage isn't about the specific issue, esteem. It's about the loss of control, because boundaries expose something narcissistic patterns struggle deeply with: limitation. When you say no, when you disagree, when you disengage, esteem, you are signaling that they are not omnipotent in your world anymore. That's destabilizing to a fragile ego structure. And so the reaction intensifies. Sometimes it's not explosive, esteem. Sometimes it's cold, the silent treatment appears, emotional withdrawal. Stonewalling, you feel frozen out, ignored. Punished with absence, silence becomes a weapon, esteem. And here's what's important to understand: both rage and silence serve the same purpose. They are attempts to regain control. Rage intimidates. Silence destabilizes, esteem. Both are designed to pull you back into reaction. If you react emotionally to rage, control is reestablished. If you chase during silence, control is reestablished, esteem. The goal is not resolution. The goal is power. Another escalation that often appears when control slips is triangulation. Suddenly, other people are brought into the narrative, esteemed. A coworker is praised a little too enthusiastically. Friends are told a different version of events. You may hear, "Everyone agrees with me," or, esteem, "Even my friends think you're overreacting." Now the dynamic isn't just between you and them. It's widened. Triangulation serves multiple functions. It provokes jealousy, esteem. It creates insecurity. It pressures you to compete, and it shifts the narrative away from the original issue. Instead of focusing on the boundary you set, esteem, you're now focused on who they're talking to, who they're praising, what others think. Again, control shifts back to them, esteem. Another behavior that surfaces when control is threatened is the smear campaign. This one can feel particularly painful. You may discover that stories about you are being told, esteem. Distorted versions, exaggerated narratives, outright lies. Your character may be questioned. Your mental stability may be subtly undermined. And if you've already experienced gaslighting, esteem, this hits even harder. Because now it's not just your internal reality being questioned, it's your external reputation, esteem. Smear campaigns often emerge when the narcissistic individual senses abandonment or exposure. If you are leaving or pulling back or seeing clearly, esteem, they may attempt to secure their image by discrediting yours. It's a defensive maneuver. If they can position you as unstable, dramatic, ungrateful, or cruel, esteem, then they don't have to confront their own behavior. The narrative stays intact. And then there's hoovering. This is the sudden reappearance of charm, of affection, of apology, of promises, esteem. You've realized what I lost. I can't live without you. Let's start over? It can feel sincere. It can feel emotional, esteem. It can feel like the version of them you fell for at the beginning. But remember the pattern. When control feels lost, regaining supply becomes urgent, esteem. Hoovering is an attempt to pull you back into the dynamic before you fully detach. It often mirrors the early love bombing phase: intensity, urgency, emotional declarations, esteem. And if you've been enduring rage or silence or smear campaigns, the sudden warmth can feel like relief. That contrast is powerful. But here's what you need to ask: is this consistent change, esteem, or reactive desperation? Real change is slow. It's demonstrated over time. It includes accountability without defensiveness. It includes sustained effort, not grand declarations, esteem. Escalation behaviors are usually reactive. Let's talk about something else that happens when control slips: projection intensifies. Accusations may increase, esteem. You might suddenly be called controlling, selfish, manipulative, the very behaviors you've been experiencing from them. Projection is protective. If they can assign their traits to you, esteem, they avoid facing them internally. And when you're already destabilized, you may pause and think, am I controlling? Am I selfish? That self-reflection is your empathy again, esteem. But notice the timing. These accusations often surface when you assert independence. Another critical piece here is unpredictability. The dynamic may become more chaotic. Esteem, emotional highs and lows intensify. You might experience cycles of rage followed by affection, silence followed by grand gestures. Chaos keeps you disoriented, esteem. And disorientation keeps you reactive. When you are busy managing emotional turbulence, you have less energy to step back and assess the pattern, esteem. Now here's something that's crucial to understand: escalation when control is threatened is not a sign that you mattered more. It's not proof that the love was deeper than you thought, esteem. It's evidence that the supply felt threatened, and that can be painful to accept, because part of you may interpret the escalation as passion, as attachment, esteem, as evidence that you were important. But healthy love does not escalate into intimidation, punishment, or chaos when boundaries are set. Healthy love respects autonomy, esteem. If someone reacts to your independence with hostility, that tells you something fundamental about the structure of the relationship. Let's connect this back to you. When you begin detaching, esteem, emotionally or physically, you may feel guilt, especially if escalation behaviors intensify. You may think, esteem, maybe I should calm them down. Maybe I shouldn't have set that boundary so firmly. Maybe I'm being harsh. But boundaries do not cause escalation. Boundaries reveal instability, esteem. If someone cannot tolerate your autonomy without punishing you, that was always there. It was just dormant while you were accommodating. And here's another difficult truth, esteem. Sometimes escalation becomes more severe when it becomes clear that you are truly leaving. The mask can drop more fully. You may see behavior that shocks you, words that cut deeper, esteem. Actions that feel unrecognizable compared to the person you met. That moment can be clarifying and devastating because it forces you to reconcile the illusion with reality. But clarity, esteem, even when painful, is stabilizing in the long run. When you stop interpreting escalation as love and start interpreting it as control, your nervous system begins to recalibrate. Esteem, you stop chasing calm. You stop negotiating your own needs to reduce volatility. You begin choosing stability over intensity. And that's powerful. Now, esteem. Does every narcissistic individual escalate in dramatic ways? Not necessarily. Some escalate subtly, with withdrawal, with passive-aggressive comments, with strategic vulnerability. Esteem. But the core remains the same. When control feels threatened, behavior shifts in an attempt to regain it. So here's the question to ask yourself, esteem. What happened when you started seeing clearly? Did communication improve? Did accountability increase? Did respect deepen? Or did chaos intensify? Esteem. Your answer tells you more than promises ever could. You are not responsible for regulating someone else's fragile ego. You are not obligated to remain small so someone else feels big. Esteem. You are not required to sacrifice autonomy to maintain someone else's illusion of control. Escalation is not proof of love, it is proof of dependency on control. And when you understand that, esteem, something inside you steadies. You stop being intimidated by the rage. You stop being hooked by the hoovering. You stop being destabilized by the smear campaigns. Esteem. You see them as what they are, attempts to regain power. And power only works when you hand it over. So if you are in the midst of that escalation right now, if you're seeing the anger, esteem, the silence, the chaos, the sudden affection, understand this: the storm often gets louder right before you step out of it. Do not confuse volume with depth, esteem. Do not confuse desperation with devotion. Do not confuse escalation with evidence of love. Because here is the truth that anchors all of this, esteem. When someone loses control and chooses chaos over accountability, they are revealing who they were all along, esteem. After everything we've walked through, the pattern, the intensity, the gaslighting, the way empathy gets exploited, the escalation when control slips, esteem, we arrive at the part that is both the most freeing and the most difficult. Healing. And here is the first truth that many people resist when they're coming out of a narcissistic dynamic, esteem. You may never get closure from them. You may never get the apology that makes sense. You may never get the accountability you hoped for. You may never hear, "I was wrong," esteem. You may never have that calm, mature conversation where everything is acknowledged and resolved. And if you keep waiting for that moment, esteem, you stay psychologically tethered to the very system that hurt you, esteem. Because waiting for closure from someone who avoids accountability is like waiting for clarity from someone committed to distortion. It keeps you stuck, esteem. We are often taught that healing requires a final conversation, a clean ending, mutual understanding, but in narcissistic dynamics, closure rarely arrives in that form. If anything, esteem, attempts at closure often reopen wounds. You may be met with defensiveness, blame shifting, minimization, or even a fresh wave of charm designed to pull you back in, esteem. So healing has to begin in a different place. It begins with boundaries, not performative boundaries, not dramatic ultimatums, not speeches meant to finally make them understand, esteem. Real boundaries are quieter than that. They are decisions you make for yourself. Boundaries are not about changing someone else's behavior, esteem. They are about defining what you will and will not participate in. And that shift is profound for many people leaving narcissistic relationships, esteem. The hardest part is not identifying the dysfunction, it's tolerating the discomfort of stepping away from it. Because your nervous system has been conditioned. It's used to intensity, esteem. It's used to unpredictability. It's used to scanning for cues. Calm can feel unfamiliar at first. You might even mistake calm for boredom. That's the residue of intermittent reinforcement. Esteem, your brain got used to highs and lows, so when stability appears, it can feel flat. But flat is not the same as empty. Flat can be peaceful. Esteem. Healing requires retraining your nervous system to feel safe in steadiness, and that takes time. One of the first boundaries many people establish is physical or digital distance. Esteem, limiting contact, blocking, muting, reducing exposure. This is not about cruelty, it's about nervous system regulation. If every notification triggers anxiety, esteem. If every message pulls you back into analysis, distance becomes medicine. And here's where it gets hard. When you create distance, there may be attempts to break it. Hoovering, esteem, sudden vulnerability. Apologies, crisis narratives. The temptation to respond can feel overwhelming. Because part of you still wants resolution. Part of you still hopes for transformation, esteem. But ask yourself, are you responding out of clarity or out of conditioning? Boundaries feel uncomfortable at first because you are no longer managing someone else's emotions. Esteem, you are no longer smoothing things over. You are no longer explaining yourself repeatedly. You are simply stepping back, and stepping back often triggers guilt. Esteem, if you are an empathetic person, you may worry about being harsh. You may worry about hurting them. You may worry about being misunderstood. But here's the truth. Esteem, protecting your mental health is not cruelty, it is responsibility. Healing also requires reclaiming your self-trust. Gaslighting chipped away at it. Esteem, you may have stopped trusting your perceptions, your instincts, your emotional responses. So part of recovery is rebuilding that internal compass. That can look simple at first. Esteem, checking in with yourself. Asking, what do I actually feel? Not what should I feel? Not what would keep the peace. What do I feel? Esteem. You begin honoring your own discomfort instead of overriding it. You begin noticing red flags instead of rationalizing them. You begin valuing consistency over intensity. And slowly, esteem, your sense of self stabilizes. Another crucial part of healing is grieving, not just the relationship, but the fantasy, the future you imagined, the version of them you hoped would reappear. Esteem, the investment you made. Grief doesn't mean you want to go back. It means you are acknowledging loss. And grief can coexist with clarity. Esteem, you can know something was unhealthy and still miss parts of it. That doesn't make you weak. It makes you human. What matters is not the presence of longing, it's what you do with it. Esteem, do you let longing override your boundaries? Or do you let longing pass through without acting on it? That's growth. Healing also requires redefining what love means to you. Esteem, if you were conditioned to equate love with intensity, with urgency, with dramatic reconciliation, then stable love may initially feel unfamiliar. Esteem, but stable love does not require chaos to prove itself. Stable love allows for disagreement without destabilization. It allows for boundaries without retaliation. Esteem, it allows for autonomy without punishment. Part of healing is recalibrating your definition of connection, and that involves patience. Because after narcissistic dynamics, esteem, your nervous system may still be on high alert. You may be more cautious, more observant. That's not a flaw, that's wisdom integrating. But there's a balance to strike. Esteem, you don't want to swing from over-accommodating to hyper-guarded. The goal is not to build walls, it's to build filters. Walls shut everyone out. Esteem, filters let healthy people in while keeping harmful patterns out. Another piece of healing is reclaiming your identity. In narcissistic relationships, you may have shrunk parts of yourself. Esteem, you may have silenced opinions, avoided hobbies, drifted from friends, softened goals. So ask yourself, who was I before this dynamic? What did I enjoy? What energized me? Esteem, who made me feel grounded? Reconnecting with those parts of yourself is restorative. You are not starting from scratch, you are returning to yourself. Therapy can be powerful here. Esteem, support groups can be powerful. Honest friendships can be powerful. Being in spaces where your experience is validated helps counteract the distortion you endured. But healing is not linear. Esteem, some days you will feel strong, clear, detached. Other days you may feel triggered by a memory, a song, a date on the calendar. That doesn't mean you failed. It means healing is layered. Esteem. And here's something important: forgiveness is not a prerequisite for healing. You do not need to excuse behavior to move forward. You do not need to reconcile to reclaim peace. Forgiveness, esteem, if it happens, is for you, and it cannot be forced. What matters more than forgiveness is boundary maintenance. Because healing is not just about leaving the relationship. Esteem, it's about ensuring you don't re-enter the same pattern in a different form. That means paying attention to early red flags in the future. Esteem, watching how someone responds to no, observing how they handle accountability, noticing whether empathy flows both ways. You are not becoming cynical, you are becoming discerning. Esteem, and discernment is empowering. Perhaps the hardest part of this final stage is accepting that some questions may never be answered. Why did they do that? Did they ever really love me? Esteem, was any of it real? You may never get definitive answers. But here's what you can answer: how did it make you feel? What did it cost you? What do you deserve moving forward? Esteem, those answers are enough. Closure is not something someone gives you. It is something you claim. You claim it when you stop trying to convince them. Esteem, you claim it when you stop explaining yourself repeatedly. You claim it when you accept that their version of events may never align with yours, and you no longer need it to. That is freedom. Esteem, freedom is not dramatic, it's subtle. It's the first night you sleep without replaying arguments. It's the first day you don't check their social media. Esteem, it's the moment you notice you feel calm instead of anxious. It's when your nervous system realizes the threat is past. And then something beautiful happens. Your energy, esteem once consumed by managing chaos, becomes available again for creativity, for friendships, for purpose, for joy. First day, begin choosing differently, not from fear, esteem, but from clarity. You no longer chase intensity. You no longer confuse volatility with passion. You no longer negotiate your own worth for connection, esteem. You understand that love without respect is not love. Attention without empathy is not intimacy, and apologies without change are not repair. Healing does not mean the experience disappears, esteem. It means it no longer defines you. And if there is one thing I want you to leave with, it's this. You do not need their closure to move forward. You only need your clarity, esteem, and the courage to honor it.